Some Gospels I feel should be read twice just so we can really soak it in. This is definitely not one of those. So, Merry Christmas to everyone. This is what the great saints have called the birthday of life itself. Today is the birthday of life. When Jesus Christ, who is the only light and life of the world, descended into our world of death and darkness so that we could see with our own eyes the hope of our resurrection, the hope of our salvation. Therefore, we are commanded this day to rejoice. It's one of the few times when we are commanded in the liturgy to rejoice. No matter what is happening in our lives, nothing is more important than the realization of the birthday of life itself taking place in our world. Pope St. Leo the Great in the 5th century, preaching to his congregation, even back then, said, "Dearly beloved, today our Savior is born. Let us rejoice. Sadness should have no place on the birthday of life. The fear of death has been swallowed up. Life brings us joy with the promise of eternal happiness." That's the purpose of Jesus Christ's birth, the birth and nativity that we celebrate today. It's the birth of the hope of the resurrection from the dead that we finally have after this great waiting and this long genealogy of waiting for that Messiah to come. Today is the day that we see with our own eyes that realization. And I really want to invite us all to see if in this season, over this next 8 days, this 8 day of octave, can I have all of my joy flowing from that reality? Can the reality of Christ's birth in this world and the Catholic faith that has so defined my life, can that be the foundation of my joy for the next 8 days, more than anything else? Because Christmas is a beautiful time. It's a beautiful time when we all come together and celebrate and eat and give and receive gifts. But it's also a time of suffering for many. It's a time when many remember things that were past and are no longer present. It's a time to remember loved ones that are no longer with us. It's a time to be grateful for family, and definitely a time to be reminded of the imperfections of family when we spend so much time together. And still, regardless of wherever this Christmas finds us, we are commanded to rejoice. Why? Because Christ, my Savior, has been born into this world. You know, we had such a dramatic gospel reading today, following the genealogy of Christ from Abraham all the way till his birth. And what this is meant to convey to us through all of these names that were listed is the fidelity of God to his people, regardless of how much chaos and sorrow and sin and disobedience was in that lineage. When God says in that first reading, "I will never forsake you. I will espouse you to myself. And I will not stop until your name is written on the palms of my hand and you are wearing the crown of victory." That's meant to encapsulate God's persevering love in our life and in history. That he would stop at nothing to find us where we are and bring us back. It reminded me of two styles of painting. I thought this is about the point I'd start losing you, so I gave you pictures to look at. And did you all get those pictures? Pass them around. There's some more in the back, but it's going to be awkward for you to get up at this point, so you can get them when you're leaving. But these two pictures, if you can see it very well, they're pretty small and dark. The one on the left is a style of painting called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro means light and darkness. This came in the Renaissance period. And what they wanted to emphasize, if you look into that picture, you'll see that there's such heavy darkness in the background. And the light has nothing to do with the darkness. What chiaroscuro means light and darkness, what it was represented by was very sharp colors and distinction between light and darkness. Fun fact, the Godfather movie was based on chiaroscuro. A lot of heavy lights and darknesses to bring out the figures. The other one to the right of that is called Sfumato. And Sfumato in Italian means smoky. And this came after the chiaroscuro period. And what they started doing, instead of making all their paintings with first drawing it out with pencils so they keep everything perfectly in place, what's going to be in the light and what's going to be in the darkness, they skipped all that. And they just painted. And the sfumato, the smokiness, represents the blending of all the colors, the light and the darkness, throughout the entire image to where you don't know where one begins and the other ends. It's two different, very different ways of painting. But I also think it's two very different ways of seeing life. If I had my choice about what life should look like, I would prefer chiaroscuro. Good and bad, sin and grace, light and darkness, all in their proper place, separated. So I would know how to avoid what is bad and how to follow what is good. And yet when we look at the history of salvation, it is not chiaroscuro. It is sfumato. It seems that God willed in his infinite wisdom to prefer a more shadowy, murky, kind of confused image of where the good and the bad commingle, the sin and the grace. When we see this especially in the genealogy of Jesus. So you would think in the midst of all the darkness in the world and the family lines, that at least the genealogy of Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, that alone at least would be pure light in the midst of the darkness. Yet that's not the case. Of all the kings that were mentioned in this genealogy, only two of them were faithful to God. Hezekiah and Jeroboam. The rest of them were idolaters. They rejected God's commandments. Some were murderers and thieves. They lived immoral lives. And most of all, they were just disobedient to what God wanted of them. Even David, right, the most famous and beloved of all the kings in history. He who was a man always after God's heart was also the one to kill Uriah and marry his wife. Murder and adultery. Sin and grace mixed in one heart. And you look at the names of the women. All were in less than ideal circumstances. So Tamar was a sinner. Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth, she wasn't even a Jew. She was a foreigner. And the fourth woman that's mentioned in the genealogy, what's fascinating is they won't even use her name. They just say, David became the father of Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, the woman with whom David committed adultery before killing her husband, Uriah. And yet, in this very dysfunctional family line, that's exactly where salvation came into the world. That's not chiaroscuro. That's not clear separation between light and darkness, sin and grace, obedience and disobedience. That's sfumato. That's all of these things being blended together to create the masterpiece of God's great work in this world, which is the incarnation of his Son, Jesus Christ, for our salvation. And that's really something for us to ponder today. That God didn't need a perfect line to come through. He didn't choose to be born outside of our brokenness and our frailty and our sinfulness. Why? Because that's our reality too. The Sfumato of light and darkness, good and evil, that's our family history. That's our nation's history. That's our Catholic Church's history. And if we're really honest with ourselves, that's also our own personal history. None of us is pure light. None of us is pure darkness. We're all an amalgamation of the light and the darkness, subtly blending together like smoke through our free cooperation with God's grace in our lives. And there's not a clear distinction between where one begins and the other ends. And I think the real joy of Christmas that can be ours is the realization that wherever I'm at in my own life and whatever I've come through or whoever I'm with, do I recognize the Son of God being born in the midst of that? Do I see His light and His grace and His persevering love finding me even there? That's why salvation is Sfumato. Because our life on this earth is Sfumato. And the joy of Christmas that we're commanded to enter into the day today, regardless of our circumstances, can only come from that realization. My Savior is born, and I see Him bringing all things to good in my life, in the present moment. May we all have the vision of the shepherds, the wise men, and the Holy Family to recognize and experience tonight the Sfumato of God's presence still at work in our world, in our church, and in our own lives today. And may we rejoice in it.